Rome, AD 100, the height of Roman civilization. Markets are bustling, crowds are chanting at the still newly built Colosseum, and your house is on fire. What do you do? Obviously you can't just call 112, but is there even a fire department at this point in history? At least, those are the questions you ponder as a bunch of guys run past you with buckets of water. So how did people fight fires in the ancient world? In fact, how did they get their water? And actually, what was it even like to live in a city before the Industrial Revolution? By the way, this is a follow-up to another video I made last year, How Did Cities Work Before Cars, in which I green screened myself into a bunch of video game cities and talked about how ancient and medieval cities worked. You don't have to have seen that video to understand this one, of course, but this video will touch upon a lot of the things that I didn't get the chance to touch upon in that previous video. Like, for instance, what was it actually like to live in one of these cities? First off, if we want to talk about what it was like to live in one of these cities, where are you living? If I'm to be your time-traveling realtor, what should you be able to expect? Well, houses are just as culturally diverse as cultures themselves, be they in Memphis in the 15th century BC or Tenochtitlan in the 15th century AD. So I'm going to have to generalize a little bit. While single-family detached houses were as common as ever, as towns grew into large cities, space within the city's walls grew ever scarce, necessitating the rise of the first apartments. In Carthage and Teotihuacan alike, apartments quickly became the norm. But perhaps the most notable example of an ancient apartment complex was the Roman insula, meaning island. These insulae, usually taking up a whole city block, were 4-story buildings with shops on the ground floor, apartments on the upper 3, and usually a courtyard of some kind in the middle. I talked more about these in the previous video, so I'll be quick in getting onto other examples, but Roman insulae had apartments that could have had multiple rooms, including kitchens, some even with running water, though we'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. The reason I noted the multiple rooms thing is because one common arrangement for poorer families was for houses and apartments to have essentially one giant room for everyone, partially because it was easier to build, but also because it was easier to heat up and cool down. In the famous timber frame houses of medieval Central Europe, for instance, you might find a family on each level of the building, or one wealthy family owning the whole building. You would likely have had a kitchen with an oven, though certainly not a refrigerator. So unless you want to keep gnawing at last week's ultra salty salami, let's go to the markets. In a lot of cities around the ancient world, your apartment might have been on top of a small shop of some kind, which was probably obvious with all the noise from down below, but hey, at least your commute's easy. For raw ingredients and things you don't have to cook, going to the market was of course always the best idea, with restaurants and tabernae offering ready-made food. In the Middle Ages, bread prices were standardized and loaves were required to be of a certain size, with bakers required to stamp their loaves with their logos so the town knew exactly who was trying to cheat the system. Stepping past the shops, one thing you notice is all the animals. They're not necessarily roaming the streets freely, remember someone owns these animals, but cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens in pens right beside urban apartment buildings would have been a common sight, on top of the horses, donkeys, and oxen on the streets. Walking over the stepstone crosswalks, you explored the different streets, each lined with a certain kind of shop. A lot of these shops might have been located close to other shops selling the goods they themselves needed, so if you can't find the blacksmiths, look for a weaponsmith or an armorer, and they're probably not far away. Some industries though would have been kept a good ways away from the city center, most notably butchers and tanners, mainly because, well, your nose is begging you to take the hint already. Naturally, these cities were rarely lacking in what urban planners and their YouTube viewers call third places, that is, somewhere to hang out besides the house or the workplace. Whether it be the agoras of Greek cities, the similar fora in later Roman cities, or China's imperial tea houses. In many smaller medieval European cities, the only real large public space was the church, which was often used for secular affairs as well as religious ones. This Minecraft city, by the way, isn't supposed to be based on any one culture or period, more of a fictional amalgamation of different historical trends with a bit of artistic license on my part. But if you walk inside the temples, you can watch people praying to the YouTube algorithm by clicking the subscribe button and ringing the bells. In the actual world, every few hours you hear the ringing of a bell, announcing the time of day. While clock towers are still a common sight today, even if their purpose is mostly aesthetic, before mechanical clocks were commonplace, the best ways of measuring time were sundials or water clocks. known to their Greek inventors as klepsydra, or klepsydra if you're one of those modern Greeks, with the bells broadcasting the time of day across town. This might not have been every single hour though. While the concept of the 24-hour day dates back thousands of years, for the most part people would have cared more about how much daylight was left in the day rather than the exact precise time. But of course, water clocks aren't the only things that needed water. So how did the people in these cities get it? The most obvious place to get your drinking water is of course the river, and indeed that's where most people in most cities would have gotten their water. However, there might be a few issues with that, especially if your house is too far from the river, or you're up on a hill because it was easier to defend, or the river is too polluted from people thinking it's a good idea to dump sewage upriver, or the river is too non-existent. In those cases, a tried and tested solution was, well, while most rainwater simply evaporates, a lot of it goes underground until it gets as far down into the soil as it can go, which is called the water table. This groundwater can then just be scooped up from a hole dug down into the water table. You can also collect the rainwater directly and just cut out the middleman, as many Roman villas in Pompeii demonstrate, having a kind of indent in the middle of their courtyards called impluia, where the rainwater would be collected in an underground cistern. When it comes to water, of course, again we must look to Rome and particularly its oh-so-famous aqueducts, carrying fresh water from a nearby, or sometimes not so nearby, mountain into the city. At the end of this long journey, the water would make its way into a reservoir, where the flow of water split off into three directions, one for the residences of the wealthy, one for the public bathhouses, and one for the public fountains where everyone else gathered their water. This was so, whenever there wasn't enough water for all three, the first one or two could be shut off to make sure everyone else in the city still got their water, even when there was less to go around. The Romans weren't the only ones building aqueducts, of course. Tenochtitlan was supplied by aqueducts, as was the ancient Indian city of Hampi. In Iran, meanwhile, a similar technology called the qanat has also been used for thousands of years. Qanats are essentially like underground aqueducts. I mean, so are Roman aqueducts, but these work differently, collecting groundwater from aquifers to where they might be needed, like cities or farms. And of course, 2,000 years before Rome, 5,000 kilometers to the east, the cities of the Indus Valley civilization also had advanced sewer systems like those of Rome. Cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Lothal, and Dolavira all had vast networks of sewers connecting every house to the system, filling the public baths and allowing wastewater to be drained away. Now, as I've said before, cities are like organisms, and as I've also pointed out before, organisms produce a lot of waste. And since cities not only function like organisms, but also contain thousands of smaller organisms within them, how did cities deal with all this waste, both bodily and otherwise? I'm not going to go too in detail with the descriptions, of course. You can still eat while watching this, don't worry. But when it came to human waste, unsurprisingly, these sewers also helped a lot. Medieval Europe is infamous for the idea that people just dump their waste out of the windows onto the streets below. And while this did occasionally happen, even in clean, civilized Rome, this is usually illegal. Not only is it gross, but when you think about it, it's not actually truly disposing of anything. I mean, after a while, unless the streets themselves are being regularly cleaned, everything would just pile up, right? Well, Pompeii actually had a system for that, as this comment from Santa was here 4877 pointed out. I couldn't find anything about this cistern on top of the hill, but the streets were shaped and angled in such a way that rainwater could simply flush the waste off of them, carrying it into the sewers at the bottom of the hill to be deposited into the sea, as was custom. There were other ways of getting rid of waste though, even without Pompeii's meticulously engineered streets or Rome's Cloaca Maxima, such as saving it for the gong farmers, who collected the so-called night soil from public latrines to be dumped outside the city. And there were other kinds of waste too. Don't worry, from food scraps in the kitchen, to debris from construction waste, to waste material from shops. Many of these ancient landfills still remain today, and to the archaeologists who call them middens, actually reveal a lot about people's habits in ancient times, as this Minute Earth video talks more on. Of course, one man's trash is another man's treasure, something which was proven especially true once human and animal waste was sold to farmers to be used as fertilizer. Selling waste to farmers or recycling urine on the International Space Station, we truly don't change, we just do things in different shapes. Street lighting is another modern luxury we take for granted. Unless you live in the UK, apparently. As the ancient world operated under a sort of bring-your-own-lamp kind of policy. But there were exceptions to this. Residences in Rome and Constantinople, for instance, often left lamps out front, and by the 15th century, such a practice would actually be mandated in London during the winter months. As you'd probably imagine, fires were a big and frequent risk to ancient cities, with open flames inside closely packed wooden buildings. So what do you do during an emergency? One of the first true organized fire departments was a force known as the Vigiles Urbani of Rome, established by Emperor Augustus. When I refer to them as a force though, like a military force, that is actually kind of what they would grow into under later emperors. A guy in Alexandria named Ctesibius had invented the first water pump a few hundred years earlier, and the cohort did have a special cart called a sifo, which was kind of like an early fire truck with a big water tank and a double-action pump. A far more common way of fighting fires throughout history, though, was the classic bucket brigade. In fact, in colonial America, there were laws in the books mandating houses and businesses own a certain number of buckets and keep them in good condition. It was thus part of the fire department's job to organize everyone into two lines, passing buckets between the nearest well and the site of the fire. Still though, the best way of putting out fires is to prevent them from happening in the first place, which for the Vigiles Urbani quickly became the primary job. There were a lot of jokes about them crashing dinner parties due to false alarms. This made them something of a police force as much as a fire department, which makes sense given their name. Switch around the words and think urban vigil. But from the time of Crassus to colonial American Victorian England, many of these fire departments were privately run businesses, meaning they often competed against each other. Optime. The story of Crassus letting houses burn down if the owners didn't pay him, by the way, is sort of partially true. Marcus Licinius Crassus is said to have become the richest man in Rome through war and fire, and when he wasn't off at war, would often buy properties that had recently burned down, or even haggle to buy them off their owners as they were burning down before rebuilding them to sell for a profit. His private fire brigade did fight fires, of course, just not out of a sense of altruism. Security, too, was often private, with wealthy individuals hiring their own guards. But that doesn't mean cities didn't have some sort of police, even if it wasn't the same concept as our modern police force. In ancient Egypt, former soldiers would be stationed near public spaces with wooden sticks, even training dogs and baboons to hunt down suspects. The development of Egyptian police forces through the Middle and New Kingdoms grew hand in hand with the development of a more complex judicial system, with these police forces carrying out interrogations, looking after prisoners, and enforcing proper religious practices to prevent blasphemy. The thing with public emergency services, though, is that they need some sort of local government for the whole being organized thing. Obviously, we all know about the various kings and democratic assemblies that ruled over the ancient and medieval worlds, but how exactly did these governments work on a local level? Normally, this will be an incredibly boring and tedious part of the video, but luckily I have an audience of 270,000 people who willingly watch videos about passports, so I think my watch time is going to be fine. In medieval Europe, with feudalism as the default mode of government, cities were generally quite autonomous, with specific town charters granting them freedom from certain feudal obligations, and being allowed to run their own governments, as well as their own courts for lesser crimes. These cities' governments were run by a mayor, who was often elected by the city council, though it could have also been hereditary, made up of an assembly of guildmasters and wealthy individuals. Inevitably, these councils came to be dominated by a few select families. In Venice, for example, 27 families would control around half the seats of the Grand Council, serving for generations, if not centuries. My main source on medieval governments, as well as most of the other medieval stuff, mentions a certain Lanstier family in Arras, France, whose members served on the council for 300 years. At least when they didn't have siblings boinking. Below the mayor and town councilors too was a vast bureaucracy of officials including clerks, magistrates, and treasurers, all handling the city's affairs and finances, though the biggest responsibility was administering justice, with officials of every rank jockeying for who got which jurisdiction, and in turn who got to make the money from issuing fines. By the way, you can buy shirts like this off the KhAnubis merch store. I've had merch for a while, I'm just really bad at shouting it out. Of course, when I say ancient cities, or ancient to medieval cities, or areas where large amounts of people lived and gathered before the admittedly arbitrary cutoff date of 1760, that's nearly 10,000 years of history spread across an entire Earth-sized planet, so obviously I had to generalize a little bit. The general vibe I keep getting from this series is essentially that pre-industrial cities were actually a lot like our modern cities, but with the occasional culture shock that completely hits you over the head. Either way, because this is a topic I really enjoy talking about, I fully plan to make more videos about this in the future, hopefully including some more non-European examples, though probably focusing on more specific subjects now that I've already made 2 entire videos about the basics. So do subscribe to be the first to see that.